In motorsport, dominance is rarely about raw performance alone. It is about alignment between engineering philosophy, regulatory timing, political leverage, and long-term strategic vision. When even one of these elements drifts out of sync, the most brilliant machines can become historical footnotes. The BMW V12 LMR engine is one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon. It was not a technical dead end. It was not an experimental failure. It was a fully realized solution to a problem that stopped existing almost immediately after it was solved. In the late 1990s, endurance racing was still rooted in mechanical endurance rather than computational efficiency. Reliability mattered more than peak figures. Smoothness mattered more than packaging. BMW understood this deeply. The decision to pursue a naturally aspirated V12 was not nostalgia. It was logic. A V12 offers inherent balance, reduced vibration, and consistent thermal behavior over long operating cycles. These traits translate directly into durability, lower component fatigue, and predictable driver behavior over multi-hour stints. The V12 LMR engine was built around these principles. Its architecture was conservative in the best sense of the word. Large displacement allowed lower stress per cylinder. Moderate specific output reduced thermal load. Mechanical simplicity reduced failure modes. In isolation, this was the perfect endurance engine. And for one brief regulatory moment, it was exactly what Le Mans rewarded. But motorsport does not reward isolation. It rewards context. And the context was already shifting while BMW was still polishing perfection. The 1999 Le Mans victory should have been the beginning of a long campaign. Instead, it became a peak followed by silence. To understand why, you need to understand how rapidly the philosophy of endurance racing was changing at the turn of the millennium. Regulatory bodies were increasingly concerned with safety, cost control, and manufacturer balance. Aerodynamic freedom was being constrained. Efficiency metrics were quietly becoming more important than outright power. Packaging flexibility began to matter as much as engine output. The V12 LMR engine, by its nature, resisted miniaturization. Its length dictated chassis proportions. Its mass influenced weight distribution. Its cooling requirements shaped bodywork. None of these were fatal flaws under the existing rules, but they became strategic disadvantages as regulations evolved. Meanwhile, Audi approached endurance racing not as an engineering purity contest, but as a systems optimization problem. Turbocharged engines offered adjustable power curves, smaller packaging, and regulatory adaptability. Audi's V8 solutions were not emotionally impressive, but they were strategically lethal. They could be tuned, restricted, boosted, or balanced to survive rule changes without fundamental redesign. BMW's V12 could not. To adapt it would have meant compromising the very characteristics that made it successful. This created an internal paradox. Evolving the engine risked destroying its reliability advantage. Not evolving it risked regulatory obsolescence. This is where many great machines die. Not on track, but on whiteboards. Another layer of the V12 LMR story lies in corporate reality. Motorsport programs do not exist in a vacuum. They compete for budget, talent, and political capital inside manufacturers. At the same time BMW was enjoying Le Mans' success, it was deeply invested in Formula One. F1 consumed resources at a scale endurance racing could not justify. Development cycles were shorter, media exposure was higher, technological transfer to road cars was easier to justify. The V12 LMR engine, despite its success, existed in a category that was becoming less central to BMW's corporate narrative. Continuing the program would have required a ground-up redesign to match future regulations. That meant new tooling, new testing, and new risk, all for a championship whose rules were still unstable. From a boardroom perspective, the decision was obvious. From an engineering perspective, it was devastating. The engine had proven itself. It had no mechanical scandal, no reliability collapse, no humiliating defeat. It simply outlived the environment that justified its existence. Motorsport history often frames success and failure as opposites. In reality, they are often sequential. Success exposes the end of a concept as clearly as failure does. The disappearance of the V12 LMR also marks a broader philosophical shift in racing. It represents the end of an era where mechanical overengineering was the safest path to victory. In its place came simulation-driven design, modular architectures, and engines built around regulatory flexibility rather than inherent balance. Modern endurance power units are astonishingly efficient, but they are also politically optimized. They exist to survive rulebooks, not to express mechanical ideals. The V12 LMR belonged to a different mindset, one where the solution was to build something so robust that variables became irrelevant. That mindset works only when the rules remain stable long enough for robustness to compound into dominance. When rules shift annually, robustness becomes rigidity. The engine becomes a monument to a philosophy that no longer fits. This is why the V12 LMR feels haunting in retrospect. It was right, just briefly, and being briefly right in motorsport is often worse than being wrong, because it leaves behind unanswered questions. What if BMW had stayed? What if regulations had stabilized? What if endurance racing had continued to reward mechanical consistency over political agility? Those questions have no answers, only echoes. The legacy of the BMW V12 LMR engine is not its victory. It is its absence. It stands as a reminder that motorsport evolution is not linear. It is opportunistic. Engines do not dominate because they are the best. They dominate because they are the best fit for a moving target. BMW built an engine that solved endurance racing as it existed. Audi built engines that solved endurance racing as it was becoming. History sided with anticipation, not perfection. TrackLore exists to preserve stories like this because they reveal the uncomfortable truth behind racing mythology. Talent, effort, and brilliance are not enough. Timing decides everything. The V12 LMR did exactly what it was designed to do. It won. Then it vanished, not because it failed, but because the world around it moved on. And in motorsport, that is the most brutal ending of all. What makes the V12 LMR story especially uncomfortable is that BMW did everything motorsport culture tells engineers to do. They built conservatively where reliability mattered. They avoided chasing peak numbers for headlines. They respected endurance racing as a discipline of survival, not spectacle. The engine was not pushed to its absolute limits because endurance racing punishes fragility more than mediocrity. Every design choice was filtered through one question: will this survive 24 hours at race pace? In that context, the V12 was not excessive. It was logical. 12 smaller pistons meant lower stress per component. Lower piston speeds reduced wear. The naturally aspirated layout eliminated turbo-related thermal spikes and failure points. The engine delivered power smoothly, reducing drivetrain shock and tire degradation. Drivers could push without fear of sudden torque spikes. This mechanical harmony translated into consistency, and consistency wins endurance races. BMW executed this philosophy perfectly. The problem is that endurance racing quietly stopped rewarding perfection in this form. As regulations tightened, races became less about mechanical survival and more about efficiency envelopes. Fuel consumption, aero drag, and hybrid integration became performance multipliers. The V12 LMR was built for a world where finishing strong was enough. The new world demanded finishing smart. Another often overlooked factor in the V12 LMR's short lifespan is the psychological impact of winning immediately. When a program succeeds too quickly, it paradoxically shortens its own development arc. BMW achieved the ultimate validation in 1999. There was no gradual climb, no long-term learning curve. The project went from concept to victory almost instantly. This left little room for evolutionary justification. If the engine had struggled initially, development momentum might have been easier to defend internally. Struggle creates narrative, victory creates closure. Once BMW stood on the top step at Le Mans, the question shifted from how to improve to why continue. Without a clear regulatory roadmap favoring the V12 concept, continued investment became harder to rationalize. Motorsport programs survive not just on results, but on future promises. The V12 LMR had already delivered its promise. What it lacked was a future that made financial and political sense. This is one of motorsport's cruelest dynamics. Winning can be an ending, not a beginning. The contrast with Audi becomes even sharper when viewed through this lens. Audi treated endurance racing as a long-term occupation, not a conquest. Their engines were not statements of purity. They were tools of adaptation. Turbocharging allowed power to be reshaped as rules evolved. Smaller displacement allowed packaging freedom as aero constraints change. Modular thinking allowed engines to survive multiple rule cycles with incremental updates. Audi did not chase emotional resonance. They chased regulatory survivability. Over time, this approach created an aura of inevitability. Audi didn't just win races. They occupied the category. BMW, by contrast, arrived with a masterpiece designed for a moment. When the moment passed, so did the machine. This difference in philosophy explains more than any single regulation change. Motorsport dominance is rarely about having the best solution. It is about having the solution that can change shape without losing identity. Looking back, the V12 LMR engine now feels like a boundary marker between eras. On one side lies traditional endurance racing, where mechanical overengineering was the ultimate hedge against uncertainty. On the other lies modern endurance racing, where uncertainty itself became a design parameter. Engineers began designing not just for performance, but for rulebook elasticity. Engines became platforms rather than statements. The V12 LMR did not belong to this new paradigm. It was too honest, too committed, too singular in purpose. That is why it resonates today. Not because it failed, but because it represents a clarity of intent that modern racing rarely allows. It answered one question perfectly, while the sport moved on to asking different ones. The deeper lesson of the BMW V12 LMR is not about engine configuration, displacement, or aspiration. It is about the danger of solving the present too completely. In motorsport, as in engineering at large, problems are rarely static. Solutions that are optimized for today can become obstacles tomorrow. BMW's V12 was not outdated by technology. It was outdated by context. That distinction matters. It reminds us that innovation is not just about building better machines, but about anticipating how the definition of better will change. The V12 LMR stands as a monument to excellence within a vanishing frame of reference. It won, it proved its philosophy, and then it quietly exited the stage. TrackLore exists for stories like this because they expose the invisible forces that shape racing history. Not lap times, not trophies, but timing, alignment, and the unforgiving pace of change.